Lately, I've been hearing more and more gamers speak about outdated games. This is typically said by new age gamers, people used to certain templates that some devs use, commonly found in big budget titles. However, some older gamers even claim that games are aging poorly, and they simply can't play those games anymore. Now, this is interesting as many consider games to be art. Personally, I have never heard any form of art being criticized negatively based on its age. So what's really going on here? Why are gamers struggling with games that have a different or old school template? Before we dive into this subject, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video. My goal is to reach 1K subs, and every little bit goes a long way. I'm very grateful for all your support and viewership, and I thank you. So what's actually going on with these gamers? Let's go ahead and just get the obvious out the way. Video games don't age. Video games literally do not change as time goes on. With the exception of games being updated, whatever you played 10 years ago is exactly what you'll be playing today. So if the game hasn't changed, what has? Well, of course, it's you, the player, that's changing. This part of the video is more for the older gamers struggling with games from the past. The games you loved a generation ago are still just as you left them. But you might be saying to yourself, I haven't changed at all. You might say, I loved shooters back then and I love shooters now. But for whatever reason, I can't return back to my favorite games. See, the problem is that you have adopted to modern game design. An example I can use is the GTA series. Imagine growing up loving the GTA games. Back then, GTA had a really arcadey-like feel. Characters didn't have any weight to them. There were no checkpoints in between missions. And the games actually had a lot more freedom in what you could do in a mission. If we look at GTA today is more hand-holdy. You have a lot of weight on the character, you have a lot of checkpoints, and you could barely even go outside the mission zone without the game failing. Because you have become accustomed to the game holding your hand and basically playing itself, you now view the older game as, well, old and outdated, because it doesn't restrict you and allows you to do more things, including making mistakes. Many people view making a mistake and dying and losing in a game as a bad thing. This is often where I hear people say that the gameplay design is outdated. The interesting part is that GTA is still built upon the foundation of GTA 3. That in itself shows you that these games don't age. Like the man who built his house on good foundation versus the man who built his house on bad foundation. The one on good foundation will last and the one on bad foundation will fall. I wonder who said that. This relates to the argument that games age badly, because if the game aged badly and those things are so old and outdated, then the foundation would be poor. The reason why the games still are good and still hold up is because the foundation lasts a lifetime. It will never get old. It will never go bad. It's simply just you complaining. Now, what about the new gamers? Well, their issue is pretty easy to solve. Like I already said, modern games are very easy compared to the majority of games from the past. The developers back then trusted that gamers would actually learn how to play a game. But unfortunately, not just in gaming, but across the board, people are becoming less intelligent and patient. The joy and sense of accomplishment that most people got from solving a problem in a game will possibly annoy or even enrage a younger person today. This is why many people beg for Souls games to have a difficulty slider. The new casual gamer has a sense of entitlement that every game they have interest in must be designed around what they want. They seem to have a hard time accepting that everything is simply not for them. So if they go back in time and play a game that's a lot harder or had little, if any, checkpoints, and didn't explain every little detail to eliminate the need to think, they will have a more difficult time playing those games. And they won't want to learn the older games mechanics. This irritation causes them to say that these games are old and outdated. But from my perspective, it's simply just a skill issue. Now, I'm not going to beat down on them as that's not the goal of this video. It's simply to point out why these things are occurring. In fairness, I was born in the 90s, and games that were before my time were a bit harder than the games that were out during the time I was young. So people older than me could run circles around me in a game like Pac-Man as they grew up in the arcades. Well, I struggled to play those games because I really didn't understand how you went about playing those types of games, as I grew up with games like Mario Brothers and games that had a little bit more explanation involved. People who grew up in the arcade era were more about trial and error, as those games were designed to just take your money. So the developers weren't trying to explain to you the ins and outs so that you could succeed, as they wanted to get more of your money. I think the major difference is just time. Because me being a gamer from a different time period, I actually still like those games and didn't look at them as old and outdated, even though they were more difficult than the games that were coming out when I was growing up. That probably had more to do with the times of people, mostly adults, teaching younger people to have an appreciation for things that aren't necessarily the new thing coming out right now. Because that's a lost art nowadays, many things across the board, from games, movies, music, it doesn't matter. Many young people or new age people don't really have respect for those things and don't seem to like them very much, and they often write them off as old, ignoring the fact that most of the things they like today is either a remake or using those old things anyway. So again, I argue, are they outdated if you're still using them? Now, we've been talking mostly from a gameplay perspective, but now let's go to graphics. Many people say they have a hard time looking at older games. Now, in fairness, this actually might have some type of validity to it. Many older games ran off of standard definition, and I can understand if you grew up with HD only, looking at things in standard definition may not look the best. However, that has a lot more to do with resolution. Many of these older games have been taken and put in a new display model, such as high definition, and the game ultimately has not changed. And people can still see that these games look nice. The funny thing is, now that I brought up standard definition, many people don't even realize that they actually still use standard definition to this day. I can guarantee you many of you have went on YouTube or went on a website or wherever, and you've actually been watching something in standard definition on your phone, not realizing that the phone didn't switch to high definition yet. And you didn't struggle not one bit looking at what you were watching. You didn't say it was ugly, you didn't say it was outdated, and you didn't say you couldn't see it. Many TV stations still display in standard definition, which can look pretty fugly on a high definition TV, but I know many people, and I'm not talking about old, I'm talking about young and new, they look at standard definition television and they don't bat an eye. But when it comes to video games, all of a sudden they're outdated because they're not in HD. So let's not act like standard definition is some obscure thing that you just can't deal with today, especially if you play on your Switch on portable mode. A lot of those games aren't even reaching 720p even on the portable Switch. But there's a bigger phenomenon here. You ever seen someone claim that when something new comes out, anything that came out before it is old or outdated or isn't playable? There's actually a term for this. It's called the shiny object syndrome. Basically, this means that some people will drop or even just outright hate things that aren't new. This again often manifests into someone claiming something is outdated, when really they just have this strange honeymoon phase of new objects and things. The funny thing is, sometimes it can even be things that aren't even necessarily new. It might be new to the person, but it definitely isn't new to the world. Like how many PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X gamers are now saying they cannot go back to 30 frames per second. They're saying anything below 60 frames per second is unplayable. Isn't it interesting that none of these gamers had this feeling before? 60 frames per second isn't new at all. Even on consoles, most games used to be 60 frames per second in the past. Once we got to the 3D gaming era for consoles, 60 frames per second became less common, but that actually took some time. The N64 era actually had a lot of games that weren't 60, but many were still 60 frames per second. PlayStation 2 era, similar thing, where there were plenty of games that were just 30 or even slightly below, but many were 60 frames per second. It probably wasn't until the 360 generation, which is probably where most of these gamers come from, where the majority of games were just not 60 frames per second. They were 30 and even oftentimes below 30. But that's if you're focusing on big titles, as many indie games, which the 360 and PS3 were known for having, were 60 frames per second. Why do they care so much today that games are 60 frames per second or not, when this option was there for them the entire time? Remember, these same people just told PC gamers that were boasting about higher frame rates that 60 frames per second didn't matter just a generation ago. This isn't even an issue that's just for console gamers. PC gamers do similar things as well. They'll claim that anything that's below 60 is outdated and that you shouldn't even play anything below 60. Well, that's until they get a Steam Deck and then the game they're playing on there can't reach 60 frames per second. Then all of a sudden anything below 60 is perfectly fine. I guess the portability aspect makes it not outdated anymore. Sure, whatever you say. Look, ultimately, the truth is games never age. If you claim that games are art, then just like any other form of art, they cannot age. Don't get all technical here saying, well, something can age and, get broken over time. We're not talking about that, people. We're talking about the game as a whole. I myself thought at one point that games might age poorly over time, but that was just a misunderstanding with my own memory. Basically, I tried replaying Sonic Adventure 2 Battle on the PC. I remember liking that game on the GameCube and thought about playing it again on Steam. But after getting past City Escape, I realized something. I had remembered wrong. See, as a kid, I remember that game being cool because, well, Sonic is cool and the cutscenes were cool and the story was interesting because for that time, for a game mostly for kids, that game had a lot of going on and it was almost like a movie or some way they shot it. I just thought the whole thing was interesting. But playing the game was the difficult part. See, it took me a long time to beat that game because outside of the Sonic stages, I really didn't like the game. So when I tried to replay it, I was remembering the good and not the bad and thought maybe the game aged poorly. But no, I didn't like this game as a kid and I don't really like it now. And that's just what that was. I'll give you a reverse situation to show you that games don't age poorly. When I was a kid, I didn't have much patience for RPGs. I didn't have a negative view of them. I just understood that they weren't for me and I just ignored them. But I remember as a kid, my cousin playing this game and I didn't really know what it was. He was fighting all these cool enemies and for some reason Disney characters were with him. When I got older and got my own PlayStation 2, I realized that game he was playing was Kingdom Hearts. And I decided to give the franchise a chance. Remember, I was watching him play and from my perspective, it was an action game. I didn't realize that Kingdom Hearts was actually an RPG. So when I got Kingdom Hearts 2 and I got hit with this long-winded introduction with a bunch of confusing things that I didn't understand what's going on, then after finally getting past it and thinking the game was going to begin, then all of a sudden this wizard gives me this book that he claims I have to read and I just turned it off. Now I'm bringing this up to say that years later, once I became an adult and my patience grew, I actually was able to sit back and play Kingdom Hearts 2 and actually the whole franchise and enjoy it. The story's stupid, but I do enjoy those games because now I have the patience to actually play them. See how I changed and the game didn't? That introduction is still long and it's still a lot of talking, which was my issue back then. That part never changed. My attitude and the way I view it did. So I think you get the point. Games never age. It's just you. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. If you don't like something, who cares? But to claim that something has aged poorly is simply false. Besides, if you hate outdated games, well, don't play the new Mario Brothers Wonder because I'm telling you, 2D Mario has not changed since Mario 3 on the NES. And you know why it hasn't? Because Nintendo made a great game so many years ago that they're able to make the same game over and over again, and all they got to do is change the graphics.